Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 161st episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. And it seems I'm going to be doing videos by personalities now because now I've been assailed by news about Russell Brand being accused of all kinds of horrendous things. I didn't even look at the details of doing things with women and being a criminal and all that stuff. And obviously, it makes sense that he's attacked from this kind of perspective of conspiracy theory of like he's been criticizing the elites a bit too much, and so they're cracking down on him. And there's many people that have rushed to his defense, other people that are calling him out. But again, let me put my non-dual glasses on because otherwise, untangling all of this is just going to be about creating factions that are opposed to one another. But his case is really interesting because, and I've watched like his interview, for instance, with Eckhart Tolle, and he's like into spirituality a lot. But when he's discussing the power elites, the vaccines, and all of these other things, it seems that he forgets this kind of perspective of spirituality, non-duality, and all of that, and really gets into the whole, like people are controlling us, freedom and all that stuff, which, I mean, I can't blame him. It's easy to sort of see things via that lens because you have all the proof necessary to show you that that's what's happening on the surface level. Plus, it sits well with his character, I think, and we'll get into that later. But let me just go through a few of the things that I want to discuss here to show why we got to that kind of point, especially why he came to that kind of point, and why the elites are doing what they're doing to him, accusing him of all these terrible things. So humanity is right now in the midst of several transitions, and there are many more that I won't list, but let me just identify the main ones. We're in the midst of a governance transition, which is from one kind of political system and organization to another. We're in the midst also of a paradigm transition that is moving from one worldview to another, from scientific empiricism and materialism to spirituality, but, and it's kind of uncomfortable. It's like difficult to define. It's something that is post-rational, let's say. And then we're also in the middle of an energy transition of sort of consuming resources in one way towards another way. And there are many other transitions, but those are like the three main ones that I want to identify here and that are relevant to what I'm about to say. So let's start with the governance one. So if you've watched my videos, you know that I have this idea that basically there's this template and that replicates, or pattern that replicates at different scales and levels throughout the universe in a fractal kind of manner. So fractals, whether you take a small fractal or a big fractal, it's the same underlying logic, just scaled upwards or downwards. So, you find that in nature everywhere. Like if you look at the pattern of a leaf, it's the same as the pattern of a tree, and it's the same as the pattern of a forest. It's all just fractals nested one inside the other. Now at the human level, we think we're not part of that kind of patterning or fractals. Very often we think that, the way we've developed, for instance, on this planet, there's just no plan for that. It's like we escaped kind of nature's tendencies to produce fractals, and we're completely off script, which is very egocentric and anthropocentric, of course, that we think that we've kind of outgrown this natural wisdom or patterns that repeat. But of course, that's not true. So there's two levels of fractals here. One is a common, like basically there's a pattern that everyone is based on, and then it scales upwards and becomes something more complex, and that is scaled upwards even more. And so it's sometimes difficult to make the link between those levels because they're not as straightforward as you might think. So the first underlying pattern, which is universal to all of humanity, is the experience of every single human growing inside a mother's womb. So to my knowledge, nobody has grown in like a cabbage patch, or has been brought by cranes, and dropped by cranes. We've all grown inside a womb. That's a universal experience to start with. Now, obviously, the experience of that growth is still slightly different. That is, what the mother is experiencing on the outside still shapes in certain ways the experience of the growing fetus, but only so slightly. Like there are certain things that are really universal, like the heart starts to develop at a certain stage, then the certain organs develop at a certain stage, then the brain, and then the limbs, and then all that stuff. And like these steps, these 9 months, and everything that happens there on a physical level, that's pretty much set. Then, as we were born, every single human has been raised by some kind of parental figure. Now, it can be the biological parents, it can be a guardian, but an adult. It can be the tribe in general, like the group of adults of a village. But generally, you've been raised by adults. I mean, I don't know of, or maybe even from some rare exceptions of people that have been raised by wolves or something. But that's also an underlying pattern that repeats throughout humanity. And so you'll see then, as humanity develops on this planet, which is kind of a cosmic womb for growing a global collective organism made up of humans as its cells, those two levels are going to inform how we develop at our level of reality. So, and you'll understand how this is relevant to what Russell Brand is experiencing towards the end of that explanation. So be patient, please, because I need to set up the stage here for explaining all of this. So just as our relationship as a growing baby kind of an organism has evolved with respect to our parents, so too the relationship of humanity towards a kind of a higher entity or organizing, organism or organization also changes. So the pattern here is the relationship of the placenta to the baby is mirrored by the relationship of parents to their children, and then it's mirrored by the relationship of governments or abstract, etheric, higher kind of institutions to humanity as a collective. The placenta is the intermediary between the mother's resources and the baby. The baby can't just, all the blood, all the resources, everything streams through the placenta and then the umbilical cord into the growing organism. Like the baby isn't like biting inside the placenta, like the womb with his teeth and sucking his mother's blood, via the mouth. It's all like trickles down through the placenta mostly. Now, the baby also swallows amniotic fluid, but most of its resources flow through the placenta. And then a child, when it's born, all of its resources flow through the parents. A child cannot just walk into a store and grab things and then walk out and have a feast. A child can access society's resources without going through the parents as an intermediary to access those resources. And at a higher level still, humanity as a collective cannot access the planetary's resources, or Mother Earth, without going through and without being this intermediary of these institutions or government. And obviously that has not always been true. And just like a very, very young fetus, like a few weeks old, isn't yet attached to the womb and the placenta is not even developed yet, and so it's kind of feeding off of, the environment or whatever. It isn't yet tethered and hasn't created that kind of intermediary between society and itself. Or it doesn't realize actually what that connection is. It's more like it's an unconscious, like it's still feeding off its mother. It didn't create a form for it, which is the placenta. Now, a baby also doesn't have the realization or consciousness that it's actually feeding off of its mother. It just knows that it's fed. It just knows that there's a tit that comes into its mouth and it just suckles it and woo, magic, there's milk that comes out of it. Great, cool. It doesn't need to like mentalize it or understand it. And then as a child is 2, 3, 4 years old, it realizes that, wait a minute, I can't grab this. If I want this, I have to ask my parents to get it for me and then I can have it. Right? Especially if it's outside the home, right? If it's something in the stores or whatever, your parents are like an intermediary. And the same for a tribe. Some 20,000 years ago, these tribes, they were just feeding off of Mother Nature. They were hunting, gathering, doing all kinds of things of early humans. their relationship to Mother Earth is the same as a few weeks old fetus or as a baby, basically, to this planet. They haven't created these institutions that say what they can or cannot do, what they can or cannot hunt. They just do their thing, right? And then as time evolves, as humanity kind of grows, then the government becomes an intermediary. Now, in order to exploit the land, in order to go and claim some natural resources, you have to abide by the laws, you have to have a property title, you have to pay your taxes, you have to do all kinds of things and meet a certain number of conditions to access these planets' resources. You cannot do it on your own. You have to ask permission to daddy government, in a way. And then the relationship also changes in terms of the psychology and the governance. So the relationship of a baby to its parents, for a baby, everything is magical. Like that's the kind of relationship that they create. Like, wow, I'm flying through the air, now somebody picked me up, and now they're manipulating these objects, and wow, they're violating the basic laws of gravity. How do they do that? And these giants, they have all the power, and they're mystical and magical, and they're dressed up in different ways. It's almost like they're different every day. And, it's just like, it doesn't understand what's happening to it. And if you look at like the very, very, very early tribal kind of belief systems, everything is magical. Like whether it's the river, the mountains, everything is magical. Nature is magical. And then the child grows into a 4 or 5 year old kid. And your relationship with your parents then is you realize that you've been created in the image of God. That is like the monotheist religion's kind of basis, You're like a mini God, a miniature version of your parents. You can walk like them, you can pretty much talk like them, but your powers are completely, like nil. Like basically your parents decide everything. They're like this, godly dictator that is benevolent at times, right? And it's really kind and loving and everything and has your interests at heart. But then at times it's because they'll just lose their shit and completely, spank you or punish you or whatever, rain down, sulfur and fire on your ass because, I don't know, you've shit your pants or something and your parents can't take it, or they lost their temper, right? And so what you're going to recreate on the outside is obviously the belief system, but also the governance structure. So the governance structure is that of divine monarchies of divine right, where you have this king, which is basically the incarnation of, they've been chosen by God to be the ruler. And they have all the power, just like your parents have all the power when you're 4 or 5 years old. They decide everything unilaterally. Like if they snap their fingers and the royal guard seizes you and decapitates you, and you don't need even to go to court and due process, all of that just goes out of the window. So humanity is kind of that irresponsible 4 or 5 year old, and there's this king that sort of decides everything. And sometimes you have benevolent kings, you have sometimes tyrannical kings, just like parents. Like some parents are very nice and some others are not very nice. And then humanity grows again, and the child grows again. The child becomes a teenager, and now that's my favorite relationship, is the relationship between a teenager and his parents is equivalent to the relationship of our society, as in representative democracies, to the citizens, to society. So the first thing is teenagers desacralize their parents, right? Their parents are no longer gods. Like you see through all of their faults, you see through all of their contradictions, and you love to point it out as a teenager. Like, you told me I should do this or that or eat healthy, and now I caught you eating chips or eating this ice cream outside of dinner time or whatever. Teenagers love to do that, like point out the contradictions. And a society will do exactly the same. They'll say, you're talking about virtues, you're talking about lockdowns and stuff, and now you're doing this COVID parties with other, ministers and whatever, and all these corrupted, government politicians, whatever. Second thing is, a teenager is going to be in a power struggle in relationship. I said desacralize. This is very important, but this is also the moment where you kill your parents as gods, So it's this idea of Nietzsche, God is dead, materialist science. Materialist science is the perfect paradigm for a teenager society, because now you think you have all the power and control because you've desacralized your parents, and now you think you have all the power and control and you master everything and whatever. Of course, it's an illusion, as we've seen time and again, because, even with all our formulas, for instance, we can't save people when there's an earthquake or a catastrophe or something. So we give ourselves the illusion of control and power through material science, which is like the teenager that's trying to reclaim control from his parents, from the universe, from the whims of the cosmic universe, by saying, oh, it's all just calculated. We can all just figure it out with math and stuff, and we don't have to be afraid. Now we have control over this universe. Obviously, that's an illusion, and that is when the teenager becomes an adult and goes into the world, and he realizes that, yeah, he may have won against his parents, so to speak, as he gained autonomy, but then the world is so vast that his illusion of control, that he had these little tiny wins against his parents via this kind of opposition, he has to really get his ego in his rightful place, because the world is not going to be yielding to him and his will all the time. And so humanity will learn that in the coming years, when eventually we get in touch with other species, ETs or whatever races, then we'll understand that our formulas can only take us so far in believing that we control and understand this universe. But yeah, let's not get sidetracked. So I was saying that the teenager is also in a power struggle against the parents to get more rights and freedom. Rings a bell? Our society since the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century are basically in a power relationship with the governments all the time, manifesting, protesting, asking more rights, more this, more that. And it's the same with the teenager. Like, Mom, I want to be able to come at home at 10 p.m. No, at 11 p.m. I want to be able to dress how I want, and I want to be able to eat what I want, and blah, 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 blah. I want more pocket money. And yeah, it's exactly the same thing that society has done at our level now as a fractal. It's like we want, the 38-hour week. We want to have, social benefits and healthcare and, a certain number of rights and all that stuff. Pensions and, whatnot. Just like all kinds of things. And finally, one of the last traits I'd like to underline is that teenagers love to criticize, but when shit really hits the fan, then teenagers still call mommy and daddy for help. It's like this teenager that is like at his party, is drunk, is like 2 or 3 a.m. and he calls his parents, Mom, Dad, please come pick me up, blah, blah, blah. So when anything happens that's really, really bad, like a crisis or something, what does society do typically? Do they organize collectively, get together and solve the problem together without considering governments or whatever, and just saying, we can take care of this. We can take care of, a road or something that's, collapsed or something, or an earthquake or whatever? Or does society turn to daddy government and say, oh, please help us. We can't do this on our own. It's your job to do it, And that's, I'm not criticizing by any means, like right now, like not at all. I'm just saying this is just a normal patterning or fractal projection of the same kind of experience that we've all had as teenagers into a broader sort of a higher kind of level. And then eventually what happens is that the teenager becomes a young adult and eventually leaves the parental nest and gains his autonomy from his parents. And that translates into our reality as blockchain, among other things, like decentralization, self-governance, decentralized governance, DAOs, echo DAOs, refi, DeFi, something fi, whatever. All of these, or cryptocurrencies, all of these things are the embryonic manifestation of a transition that is starting to occur from one kind of level of being and organizing to another level. That is also the moment where the baby is kind of born and you cut the umbilical cord because you're no longer gaining your energy, or everything doesn't flow through the placenta anymore. Now the baby can breathe with his own lungs, for instance. And so we've cut our umbilical cord once when we were born. We've cut our umbilical cord a second time when we left our parents' house. And now as society, we're cutting our umbilical cord for the third time by severing the link between us and these centralized institutions that are governments. And again, some people might say, yeah, but that's because they're evil and they're controlling and blah, blah, blah. No, you don't get it. I mean, without the placenta, the baby could not develop. Without parents, a child would also die off. I mean, no child can just, cook for themselves or whatever. And governments are this kind of pocket that create a framework for society to evolve to a point where they can manage without governments. But by no means were they evil at any point in time. Just like your parents when you're a teenager are not evil. But there are certain patterns that can repeat. So right now, we're not yet a young adult as humanity. I'm telling you, like we're just getting ready. We're just like a teenager that is planning, that is putting some money aside, that is packing his bags and stuff. But there's some other interesting patterns to note here. For instance, when a young adult leaves their parents and then goes to live with other young adults in a dorm or something, or in a shared apartment, typically it's not very, how should I say, organized or settled, or it doesn't work perfectly. Like you'll have overflowing garbage cans, you'll have leftover, rotten food, leftovers, and mismanagement of money. Like, they're spending, like when they get their student, their pay from their student job, they spend like there's no tomorrow, they party, and then they have like $100 for the rest of the month. They have to eat frozen lasagnas and pizzas, or go back to mommy and daddy to eat. And it's pretty much chaotic. And if you look at what's happening in the blockchain and decentralized space, there's a lot of awesome things going on, but there's also a lot of scandals, scams, problems, things that are not working, things that are buggy. You have theft and exploits all over the place all the time. And that's just what happens when, this young adult thinks he's going to do better than his parents. They're like, yeah, my parents, they're not even recycling, and they're eating too much meat, and they're doing this and they're doing that. And you think you can do better, and you move, and you're now on your own. And then you realize, oh, okay, that's what it takes. Actually, that's all of the things that need to be done. And you're kind of overwhelmed. But eventually, and that's the whole evolution of humanity, eventually you do better than your parents after a while. That is, and we've managed to do better in many ways. Either you're better at educating your kids, you're better at managing your finances, otherwise society would not have evolved. If like successive generations wouldn't have improved upon the parenting model, upon resource management, upon, skills and stuff, we would still be in the Middle Ages, So that's what happens. And that's what happens at the societal level as well, is that these decentralized systems eventually will improve upon the existing kind of structures and solve things in a much more efficient way, but we're not there yet. And then there's so many other things that can happen. Like, for instance, another pattern is when your teenager is getting a little too ballsy, they're like 18 or 19, and they're really in a power relationship with your parents and always criticizing them, the parents will be like, well, if you're not happy, go get a job. Or if you're not happy, then move out. Or they might actually tighten their grip even more. Now, some parents are kind of panicked at the idea of letting their young adult go free. They're like, oh, but my young adult, they're not ready yet. They're so immature. They can't fend for themselves. They have to stay at home. And then they try to sort of, consolidate their control and grip over their teenager by restricting all the rules, curtailing their pocket money, making sure that there's a curfew at 10 p.m. They need to be home by 10 p.m. and all kinds of other things. They can't drink alcohol. They can't do this. They can't do that. And that's what we're kind of seeing right now with governments that are becoming more and more controlling, that are trying to, control society in many different ways. Like CBDCs can be, central bank digital currencies can be thought of as the, mommy and daddy trying to control how you spend your pocket money, basically, like having a say, like, well, I'm going to give you this pocket money, but because you're an irresponsible young adult and I don't trust you and your decisions, I'm going to look at what you're doing with your pocket money because, you have to be responsible and blah, 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 blah. And then you have other things like, for instance, the coronavirus, all kinds of other things, wars, everything. And then at the same time, some parents also, and you have like these symbolic projections at a higher fractal level that are kind of intermingling. Some parents also are disgusted that their teens or their young adults at 19 are still at home, and they're like, but they should be fending for themselves already. You know what? Let's make ourselves insufferable so that my young adult will want to leave home even faster. And so they're like, I'm not going to cook for you anymore, or I'm not going to give you any pocket money anymore. And there are many reactions that you can have as a young adult. You can say, that's not fair, and then being in a power relationship with your parents and criticizing them and menacing them, threatening them. Or you can just leave. You can just leave, get a job, and then claim your independence in that way. And there's just so many different ways in which young adults have gained, quote unquote, their independence from their parents. And it can be in a very difficult and with all this struggle and this power relationship and critical relationship, or it can be very smooth and normal, and all of that. 20 minutes just to bring us right back to Russell Brand. What is his attitude? If you listen to his speech, he's all about freedom, 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 yes, but he's also extremely critical of governments and the elites and all that stuff. So in a sense, he represents the teenager side of society that is pinpointing all of the flaws of mommy and daddy, all of the problems, all of their manipulative schemes, all of the problems. But he's not necessarily advocating for moving beyond, I don't think so at least, because I've listened to not all of his videos, but to self-governance, decentralized governance and all that stuff, even though he's hinting at that sometimes with, talking about blockchain and all that stuff, and crypto a little bit. But he's still more like a teenager living at his parents' home, but criticizing the shit out of them. Like really, like imagine you have a family dinner and with everybody around the table, and even like maybe a dinner of all of the neighborhood. And then this teenager sort of takes the stage and starts saying, yeah, but my mom and dad, they're the worst, and they're doing this and that, and you wouldn't know what they're doing, blah, blah, blah. And the parents are like so embarrassed, and they're like, oh, I'm going to punish the hell out of you for daring to humiliate us like that in front of all the neighborhood. And basically that's what's happening to Russell Brand. It's like he's throwing out in the open all of these scandals and contradictions of the government that we're all aware of, because we all know unconsciously that our parents are not perfect, and we don't need to have the proof necessarily for that. And then the parents, obviously embarrassed by this, are going to say, well, you know what? I caught you masturbating when you were 12 in front of this TV show, in front of everyone. And the teenager's like, no, don't say that, And it's just this ridiculous thing where they're both kind of, in this relationship of throwing dirt at each other. And now that's what the elites, so quote unquote, have done, is now they've slinged back some dirt back at Russell Brand. And whether it's true or not is besides the point. It's the pattern that's important. And when you understand the pattern, you understand the non-dual nature of what is happening. And you're beyond trying to figure out whether he really did rape or didn't rape or whatever. Or you're also beyond trying to figure out, oh, but the power elites and everybody's controlling us, and where's the conspiracy and the viruses and everything. You're like, okay, I get it. Let's just transition smoothly to decentralized governance, take our time, not necessarily, criticize our governments, because that's not the way to do it, because we're still living under their roof, so to speak. I mean, they're still sovereign in a way. So you try to make the best of it, and at the same time, you start developing your autonomy, set money aside, experiment by living together, trying things, maybe living in a dorm, maybe a shared room with somebody else, with a roommate, and getting more and more of your money from outside of your parents, and that can manifest as people transitioning to Bitcoin or whatever. But you see, we've put layers upon layers of this dual thinking in it with, oh, I have Bitcoin, but that's because I won't touch fiat money anymore, it's dirty, blah blah blah. And that's like this teenager, young adult that is saying, oh, this pocket money from my parents, I'm not gonna touch it anymore. I'm only going to rely on, the money that I earn from McDonald's. And that's, and you understand that it's just silly. It's just silly. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. Use fiat, get your pocket money and see what the balance is, the rightful balance, right? So that's one thing. That's just one thing. The second thing is this paradigm shift between materialist science on the one hand, which is the teenager that has this illusion of control. I understand everything because now I'm smarter than my parents, la 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 la. It's kind of like I'm smarter than God, the teenager attitude, the materialist science. I'm smarter than God. I'm smarter than I can put all of this universe in this, cram it into this equation. To a more spiritual kind of way of thinking, where you understand that you're a part of this universe, but that this universe is much grander than you, and that there are things beyond empiricism that you just will never be able to control, and that's fine. And you make your peace with that. And so every sort of paradigm runs its course in terms of the limitations. Like if a teenager were to be released in society, then it would do something like the French Revolution. It's basically, I know best because I know everything. I've understood everything, and I'm carrier of the truth, and I'm just going to expand with that truth and impose it on everyone. That's like the story of the French Revolution. 14-year-old kid thinks he understands the world, everything, and runs away from his parents and then does crazy shit, and then comes back to his parents and says, oh, I'm sorry, I messed up. Based on very, very beautiful principles, and a lot of good things came out of it, don't get me wrong. Like human rights, the Napoleon Code, and all of, plenty of different things were really interesting from the French Revolution. But then what happened is basically the French went back under kings and queens for another half a century or something like that, before they re-explored democracy, but with a smoother kind of transition. Or not even maybe. The French have a very interesting temperament in that regard. Like they want things to be explosive. That's how they do their transitions. And so every country has their way of transitioning from teenager stage to young adult, right? I mean, some people will do it smoothly, some countries will do it smoothly, and others will do it with revolutions, and and that's just up to everyone to decide what they prefer. I prefer smooth transition because I mean, do you want to really go through decapitations and crazy stuff like the French Revolution? And so where was I going with this? Yeah, so the science, empirical science, is this kind of illusion that we can control this universe via mathematical formulas, and so we can have control over reality and understand reality, and interact with it like a vending machine. Like with the same input, I get the same output, and when I press on this button on my phone, my screen comes on, and oops, there we go. And there's no Heisenberg uncertainty principle or Schrodinger's cat mechanism here at play, where once out of twice this phone is not working or working. That's what empirical science is for, is to sort of cement a certain number of things that are going to work regardless. But then that logic also comes to a limit. And so every time we change a worldview, there's this kind of rite of passage, which can happen in many different ways. One of the ways of doing the rite of passage from one worldview to another, and that's what humanity has done so far, is that you first get to experience the limitations and the caricature of your worldview that is projected back at you to give you an objective reason to change. So picture 14th century Europe. Everybody is into monotheism and the belief in God and all that stuff. Very, very little people are. There's this embryonic thinking of empiricism that is starting to emerge, doing experiments and stuff, alchemy. But it's like most people are just monotheist and believe in God. And if you believe in God, you also believe in the apocalypse. And so the more people believe in something, the more likely it sort of manifests, because the humans are the bridge between an immaterial dimension and the material world. And what we have the power to do is superimprint ideas or immaterial thoughts and things like that on top of reality. And you just have to look around wherever you are right now to convince yourself of it. I mean, you're watching me via an idea that has taken material form through human activity, right? I mean, the screen that you're looking at me through is an idea that has taken material form, and that you can plant a seed and the computer is going to sprout out of it. And so that's what humans have the power to do, is to superimprint ideas on top of this reality, including their worldview. And they do it via different mechanisms. Like when millions and millions of people believe in the apocalypse, then it kind of manifest, like it's almost they call on that experience of reality down onto earth as a collective experience. And that's one of the best or easiest way of evolving, is just experiencing the materialization of your core beliefs, and then experiencing them and then checking whether you're still okay with your beliefs or not. So 14th century Europe, again, everybody believes in the apocalypse, and the Black Plague hits Europe and half of the population dies. I mean, imagine a situation where you're in your neighborhood and half of the people are dying right now. Now, if that's not an apocalypse, I don't know what is, right? That's one way. Like, it's the limitations of your paradigm or your worldview viewed from the outside. The outside manifestation of the consequences of believing what you believe, right? Of the paradigm that you're stuck in. And so you're like, as humans, we're like, no, actually, we don't want it to be the apocalypse. And so that's one way of shifting, or giving yourself an objective reason to shift to another worldview. It's like, I don't like this. Let's see what else there is. And so obviously, the other thing is, if you want to get out of the apocalypse as an event, out of the Black Plague, you have to shift your paradigm, because regardless, and like if you look at the Black Plague through the paradigm, through the lens of monotheist science, then the causes of the Black Plague is a punishment from God. And the solution is to pray and repent. But regardless of the number of times you prayed, did it really make a difference? But if you listened to the first few, doctors that were emerging and that were saying, maybe we should practice better bodily hygiene, and maybe we should stop interacting and touching each other when somebody has the Black Plague. We should, keep our distance and all that stuff, because there's this idea of diseases that can spread and all that stuff with material reasons. That kind of way of looking at reality actually presents a better alternative than the one of materialist science to solve that kind of problem, right? And so you're exiting the apocalypse by changing your worldview. And finally, if you still weren't convinced that monotheism was reaching a limit as to the kind of global coherence and order or that it could create with humanity, then you have the Inquisition. The Inquisition is basically witch burning, the church trying to hunt down the heretics and burn them at the stakes for blasphemy or whatever, kind of crazy reasons. And if you're careful, you'll understand that that exact pattern is repeating today with materialist science. We have climate change, which is the scientific version of the apocalypse, where the causes are readily identified and everybody knows what the causes are. It's because we're polluting too much and blah, blah, blah. And the solutions are also readily identified. You have to repent by stop driving SUVs, driving bikes around, and stop consuming, and do this and do that, and pee in the shower, and all kinds of other recommendations. Alternatively, you also have the coronavirus that hits. But the coronavirus is slightly different than the vaccines. You see, under a strictly materialist and scientific lens, if you take that to the extreme, then humans are just a biological machine. You press a certain number of buttons and you get a certain outcome, and we can all be manipulated because every single thing that happens in the brain is just neurochemical kind of processes. And if you press here, then that happens. And so you can control humans a bit like automatons eventually, once we've reverse engineered everything about humans. And so it's really like the empirical or scientific materialist vision of reality, of that worldview, tends to depict humans as just a machine. And if you look at the coronavirus and the vaccine mandates, what they have done is they have transformed humans into machines, cars that need to go and get the technical control every year to be able to have the permit to run on the road. Otherwise, you have to stay in your garage and you can't drive your car around, right? So you have to go and have your oil checked and your brakes and everything and all of that stuff. And so that's how humans were treated, basically. You have to get your shots and you have to get your card to prove that you got your shot. Otherwise, you can't drive your car on the road. If you didn't get your car checked, right? If you didn't get your oil changed, then you can't drive on the road. And it's just treating humans like machines, but a caricatured version of that, like pushing it to the extreme, just to show people what an extreme belief and dedication and sort of hanging on to materialist science and empiricism as the only worldview to be able to view reality through can go to, just how far it can go to, the extreme, being treated like machines. Humans are being treated like machines now. With this thing where, like the priests in white robes, this time not black robes, have all the answers. Just like, during the Inquisition. If the priest said, you're a heretic and you're being burned, then you're being burned. there's nothing you can do. You can't yourself take the Bible. Some people will try to take the Bible and say, no, look, I shouldn't be burned at the stakes because God says this or Jesus said that. But ultimately, is it really going to save you? No. And so you see the exact same pattern repeating again. You have a bunch of, experts, scientists, epidemiologists, scientists, whatever, that hold all the cards, that are basically the priests that are in the jury, that decide for humanity what they're supposed to do. And then there are a bunch of regular humans that are trying to leverage science as the same kind of tool, but in reverse, to try to prove that the vaccines are actually bad, objectively, and that they're dangerous, and blah, 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 blah. But understand that you're still fighting a paradigm within the same paradigm. So that's leading nowhere. And I've done many other videos to explain this, so I'm not going to go back to this, but a more spiritual version of reality is to understand that there just isn't a way to objectively identify the right course of action for every single human, because we are all unique in terms of our, who we are, in terms of our identity, our belief systems, and all that superimprints on what we manifest on the outside. Like, no people will react the same way to either the coronavirus or the vaccine, which means that it should be freely chosen. But in order to get to that, you need to first transcend empirical thinking. And here again, like Russell Brand, and you see why I'm talking about this, is because he's all about and the vaccines and all this, the scandals of the billions and the this and that. But that's besides the point. It's humanity asked for this experience, collectively speaking. Because, again, how many humans today, if you go on the street and ask them, is there a way to make decisions collectively besides empiricism? That is, when we are to make decisions collectively, as a whole, as humanity, is there another methodology besides empiricism and science to inform us on the types of decisions we should be making? Most people will say, no. Empirical thinking and getting the facts right and what is right and wrong, what is true and false, that is the only way to make collective decisions, and legitimate way. And so the universe is like, these idiots, that's what they believe. Okay, then we're going to manifest problem after problem, apocalypse after apocalypse, tragedy after tragedy. They're going to try to solve these problems via the empirical mindset. And they're going to get these horrible experiences that it's not working, or that, they're fighting between each other, or that they don't agree, or that there's this, and then they're going to fight against each other and blah, 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 until they finally let go and accept that, okay, we're not, we can't be gods. We can't control everything with empiricism and science. We have to move towards another kind of worldview. And maybe there, all the dominoes will fall into place and we'll find real novel solutions to problems that we thought were unsolvable, just like the Black Plague. We thought, like, this is the end, this is the apocalypse. And then, some people say, just wash your body. And you're like, wow. Oh, maybe that works. And so you see that on those two fronts already, Russell Brand is still in this teenager mode, kind of, where he's trying to use empirical thinking to debunk empirical thinking, using a sword against a sword, and also in this kind of teenager criticizing the government. But understand that so long as you're in that pattern, you're going nowhere. And it's the same for Greta Thunberg. It's the same for so many of the things that are happening now that is just about teenager attitude society criticizing daddy state, and throwing at daddy state all of the terrible things that he's done and all the things that he should do and improve upon. I mean, for all those that are watching me, you probably have some parents, and you're probably, I don't know, probably my age. I don't know who's watching this channel, but how many of you have managed to change your parents by yelling at them and run their household differently by rebelling and stuff from the inside? I mean, for me personally, I've managed to kind of, I didn't change my parents. It's not possible to change your parents, but I've managed to run my household, once I got my household, the way that I liked, the way I preferred. Like, for instance, not accumulating as much stuff or being a little less strict on certain things. And, and that's exactly what the self-governance kind of movement is about. Is not about like criticizing governments and being in this rebellious kind of attitude. It's about saying, you know what? If I were to take care of this piece of land via decentralized self-governance tools, how would I run it in a way that is better than what my parents have done? And I'm going to try. And I'm not going to constantly try to compare myself or be in opposition with my parents. I'm just going to do it. And so for me, the only way that Russell Brand is going to get out of this is to stop trying to be in this kind of teenager attitude and to move on towards a young adult kind of mentality of, okay, this is what's happening. We, as humanity, we're supposed to move towards more self-governance and also to have this paradigm shift between one worldview and the other. I'm going to stop criticizing my parents in front of the whole neighborhood. And encourage encourage this movement of freedom, but not freedom as in trying to conquer your parents' house and kick your parents out, but moving out of your parents' house and living on your own. And that transition, to give you and again a metaphor, is, I mean, right now at birth, the birth process, in most cases, people just, squeeze the umbilical cord and cut it right after birth. But that is a very traumatic experience for the baby, because the baby needs to switch between one way of getting resources to another instantly. It's like you're being kicked out of your parents' house and now, find a job, just, maybe you'll have to live under a bridge for a few days or a few weeks or whatever until you find a job, and then you might, get a job in revenue, and then you can move on into a small room or whatever. But that's quite wild and extreme. Another new technique of birth that is being experimented is lotus birth. And lotus birth is where you keep the placenta attached and you let the placenta dry. And then eventually, once it's dry, it falls off naturally. And in many cases, that is a much smoother way of transitioning from one way of getting energy, which is all streaming the blood, through the umbilical cord, to another way, which is breathing with your lungs and with your digestive system, which is still immature in the first few days or weeks after birth and requires time to adjust. Now, typically, many babies lose weight in the first few days after birth because their bodies have to get used to this new way of getting energy. And you could say that a teenager would also lose weight in the first few months or whatever after being kicked out of his parents' home if he had to go live under a bridge and beg for food and stuff in the street and then try to get a job or something. And humanity would also lose weight, as in many people would die if the governments would suddenly crumble and we had to self-organize and move towards self-governance right now, like instantly. So this is a process that's going to take some time. So we may as well embrace it consciously this time. And yeah, so that's one way that Russell Brand can sort of transition beyond or transcend his current way of doing things with his show, which might get him, which might prevent him from attracting so much hate or being targeted by the power elites, mommy and daddy. Yeah, and I mean, you should also put yourself in the shoes of power elites and governments. Like, if unconsciously they're basically playing the role of parents and the placenta, don't forget what happens to the placenta after birth. It's irrelevant. You can get rid of it. There's no purpose for it anymore. It has served its purpose. And so parents also, they're not as irrelevant, of course. When you move out of your parents' house, they're still there. You can still go and visit them and stuff. But they have almost no more control over the way you run your life. And in a way, all of these centralized power structures, unconsciously, they know that if once humanity moves towards self-governance, their own kind of money system, which is like the young adults starting to earn their own money, whereas not relying on the pocket money from mommy and daddy, which is basically fiat money, they will become irrelevant. And so there's a lot of people that, and some parents might be afraid of that, like losing their power over their teen, and they're like, oh, they're trying to keep them in the house at all costs because they don't want to let go of that power. So put yourself in the shoes of those power elites. Unconsciously, they can feel that this is happening because, like I said, we think we're all doing this by chance, but this is just a plan that we're following, but we're following it unconsciously. So we're like a pinball hitting against the wall, advancing in the right direction, but going bing, 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 catastrophe after catastrophe, scandal after scandal. But that's where we're heading. And there's nothing that governments can do to stop it. There's nothing that society can do to stop it, for that matter. It's like parents trying to prevent their young adult from leaving home. How long can that strategy work? And if it works, is it really warranted? Is it really positive in the end as the outcome? I mean, the longer you're trying to forcefully keep your young adult at home, the more terrible it's going to be once they lose their shit and just move out. And your relation, and it might be actually at that point this abrupt kind of experience of cutting the umbilical cord, like really violently. And so there's so many symbolic parallels here. Like Bitcoin is basically like the fat that a baby stores right before birth to be able to live through that transition from one way of feeding off of, the mother and resources like this fiat money system, and another system which is completely different. And so we're all accumulating fat right now as humanity to be able to weather that transition from the fiat system to something else. And all the experts are also agreeing, like most experts that are deep into finance and that are not buying into the public discourse of what how things are publicly discussed, that the fiat system is really, really unstable. I mean, we've seen many countries already where the fiat system kind of collapsed, quote unquote. I think Argentina, Lebanon, Turkey is on the way there. Venezuela, obviously, and so many other countries as well. You have China and the real estate bubble that's about to explode. You have an impending recession in the US. I mean, just so many signs, right, of this is happening. And at the same time, these regulators are trying to regulate crypto and control this. And it's almost like these parents that are like, oh, my kid is earning their first wage, but he's gonna spend it on booze, and he's gonna do drugs, and I'm gonna control him. I'm gonna control the way he spends that money. And it's the exact same argument at the fractal level above, which is governments saying, Bitcoin is only used for illegal activities and scams and drugs and money laundering and all that stuff. But you have to laugh at it because it's just crazy how transparent it is normally, this fractal pattern, and yet it's right there staring us in the face, and we still get caught up in all of this drama when we're totally part of nature, and we're just playing out unconsciously all of these things that are being programmed that is just a fractal pattern, a more complex fractal pattern of something that we've all experienced at a higher level. And then people that get a bit too vocal, like Russell Brand, they get chopped off. But that's because they're not approaching this from the right paradigm. They're still in the old paradigm. And it's like it's like people under the apocalypse in the 14th century moving from Catholicism to becoming an Orthodox or Protestant. I mean, how is that going to help? It doesn't. It's still the Bible. It's still monotheism. No, like the real, way of transcending that is to move on to something that is beyond this strict monotheist way of viewing reality. And there's just so many more things I could say, energy transition, obviously, but here Russell Brand is a little less active in that field. But in any case, I really invite Russell, if he's watching this, I hope he does, to completely reorient his channel, because eventually he'll realize that part of him has to die in this regard. Like the person that he thought he was, of being this person that is denouncing the elite and engaged in this, battle against the power elites and denouncing and whatever, he might like that persona, but at some point you can't keep playing that persona anymore. And the metaphor I'm going to give is quite simple. Like, imagine if a cell in the stomach and a cell in the lungs were each battling each other right as the child was about to be born. Like the cell in the stomach was denouncing the lungs for keeping all the oxygen to itself, and the lungs was denouncing that the stomach is actually not taking care of its acid fluids, and they're spilling all over the place, and they're also digesting the lungs and harming the lungs. There's only so long that you can keep playing this game of division and separation and battle of who's right and who's wrong, when you're part of a global organism and you're meant to actually harmonize your relations and realize that it's just at some point you can't do that anymore, because you're going to die. You're just going to die. And the universe is going to manifest these experiences that are saying, hey, stop playing that role of good cop, bad cop, of, the person who is the rebellious, whistleblower that denounces the power elites, and the power elites that are working in the shadows and whatever. All of these little games, quote unquote, that we're playing, it's just that at some point, it's like when you're on the sinking Titanic, are you going to play these games of who's rich and poor and who's right or wrong or whatever, or are you going to do something about what's happening, right? And so it's just letting go of that. And that's very difficult, to let a part of you that who you thought you were die, and be born as somebody else that does something else. Because we tend to conflate what we're doing with who we are, and then we have a trouble of letting go of what we're doing, because in order to do so, we have to let part of ourselves die, what we thought we were. And that's never easy. And there's a lot more to say about that again, but this video is already an hour long, so I'm going to bid you farewell. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope I'm done speaking about these personalities and moving on to more the content, the original content of the channel, which is about exploring these metaphysical and existential questions and spiritual questions in the spiritual brainstorm. So talk to you in the next video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, the usual, and don't hesitate to leave a comment if you enjoyed the video. Bye.